Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun had barely risen over the dry plains when Elias Hart rode across the empty stretch of his failing ranch. The land once held promise-wide fields of golden grass, a river running steady through the valley, and cattle that grazed freely. But years of drought, a market collapse, and a fire that devoured half the herd had left him with nothing but parched dirt and broken hopes. Still, he worked the land from sunrise to dusk, holding onto the last fragile belief that hard work alone could reverse the weight of his misfortune. Yet beneath that hope lay an unspoken truth. Elias Hart was drowning in debt. A year ago, he had turned to the last man any rancher wanted to owe, Barlow Creed, a wealthy cattle baron whose shadow stretched farther than the desert horizon. Creed's money came with no kindness, only contracts inked in fear and consequences whispered through the townsfolk who trembled at his name. And now those consequences were closing in. Elias knew the day would come when Creed demanded repayment. But he had imagined he'd have something: cattle, land, money, anything to bargain with. Instead, he had nothing except the old ranch shack and the worn saddle on his horse. When Creed's riders appeared in a rising cloud of dust on the ridge, Elias felt the moment arrive like a knot tightening in his chest. The riders approached with slow, deliberate steps, their silhouettes cutting through the haze of morning. At their center rode Creed himself, straight backed, dressed in black like a crow circling misfortune. His presence alone seemed to quiet the wind. Elias stood tall as they dismounted, though inside he felt the ground slipping from under him. The men inspected the ranch with cold interest: empty pens, broken fences, a barn with its roof caved in. There was nothing of value here, and they knew it. Creed was a man who enjoyed watching others grapple with fear, and as he surveyed the ranch, Elias sensed that he had arrived not just to collect, but to decide the fate of a man who had run out of time. The landowner waited in the stillness, remembering every hard year that led him to this moment. He had fought to rebuild after the fire, pushing his strength past its limit, sleeping under the stars when the roof of his home rotted through. But misfortune had never loosened its grip. Now, even the earth beneath his boots felt borrowed, just another thing he would soon lose. Creed did not speak. He never needed to. His gaze alone spelled judgment, and his men shifted in anticipation of the order they expected: the seizure of the ranch, the final stripping of all Elias owned. But then something happened that Elias could not have predicted. From behind the riders, a covered wagon approached, driven by a single older woman. Her eyes flicked toward Creed with the caution of someone who had learned long ago not to be noticed by him. She opened the back of the wagon and helped down a young woman, slender, pale, and trembling from exhaustion. Her clothes were dusty, torn at the edges as though she had spent several nights traveling without rest. Even from a distance, Elias saw that she carried the weight of fear in her movements. Barlow Creed watched her closely, but not with warmth. His gaze was calculating, wary, almost irritated. Whatever her presence meant, it was clear she was not there by her own choice. The older woman whispered something to the girl, placing a trembling hand on her shoulder before stepping back with an expression of guilt. The girl lifted her eyes, hesitantly meeting Elias's gaze across the yard. In that brief moment, Elias saw something beyond fierce, something layered with sorrow, defiance, and a plea she didn't dare voice. Her stare lingered just long enough for him to realize She had been brought here with a purpose he wasn't yet aware of. Creed finally focused on Elias with a cold, decisive look. Elias felt the weight of whatever was coming next before it was even revealed. He sensed that Creed had arrived with a different kind of ultimatum, one that would test not just his pride, but his conscience. Then the truth surfaced. The girl was Leela Creed, Barlow Creed's only daughter. Kept hidden from public life, whispered about by ranchers who had never seen her but heard rumors of a fragile spirit, kept sheltered behind iron walls. Now those walls had broken. Word had spread of threats rising against Creed's empire, enemies he had made in the shadows of his ambition. Leela had become a target, and Creed, despite his wealth, trusted no man under his command to protect her without question or motive. So he had made an offer, a decision as cruel as it was calculated. He brought his daughter to the one man who owed him more than any other, knowing Elias had nothing left to bargain with except his loyalty. Creed's demand was simple and merciless. Elias would shelter Leela on his ranch, away from the eyes of Creed's enemies, until the threat was eliminated. In return, the crushing debt hanging around Elias's life would be forgiven, wiped clean, as though it had never existed. Elias felt the ground tilt. Creed wasn't asking for a debt to be paid. He was turning the debt into a prison for them both. At first, Elias refused the idea in his mind. He wanted no part in Creed's power games, nor in being the warden of a girl whose eyes spoke of a life chained by her father's decisions. Taking responsibility for her safety felt impossible. He barely survived protecting himself. But then Elias truly looked at Leela. He saw the way she held her breath, the way her hands clutched one another, as if they were her last anchor, the way her entire being trembled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Her gaze was tired, hollow, a heart worn thin by years of captivity beneath her father's rule. This was not a spoiled rancher's daughter. This was someone who had lived quietly under the weight of another man's choices, someone now being forced into yet another cage. And in that moment, everything within Elias shifted. He realized she wasn't being offered as part of a bargain. She was being abandoned. She wasn't a payment. She was a burden Creed no longer wished to carry alone. The realization struck Elias deeper than any threat could have. He saw the truth behind Creed's stern posture. The daughter was a loose thread in the empire he had built, and stashing her away on a bankrupt ranch served two purposes: protection and convenience. Elias felt a slow, rising anger not at Leela, but at the father who used her as a pawn. Creed's men watched Elias, waiting for resistance. But Elias took one steady breath. He knew refusing would destroy him. He knew accepting would change everything. And he knew Leela had no say in any of it. The rancher stepped back, torn between pride and compassion, weighed down by the knowledge that one choice would define the path ahead. When Creed finally turned his horse, leaving Leela standing alone in the dusty yard, Elias understood that his life, already battered, already broken, had crossed into a new and uncertain territory. He had nothing left, except a promise he hadn't yet made, but already felt bound to. As the dust of Creed's departure faded into the horizon, the girl's fragile silhouette remained silent, uncertain, and waiting for a fate she feared yet dared to hope might be kinder than the one she left behind. And with the sun sinking behind the distant hills, Elias realized the hardest chapter of his life was only beginning. The ranch fell into an uneasy silence after Barlow Creed and his riders disappeared beyond the ridge. Dust settled slowly over the yard, drifting around Elias' heart, and the young woman left in his care. For a long moment neither moved. The air hung heavy with uncertainty, as though even the wind hesitated to disturb what had just unfolded. Elias stood with his hands at his sides, unsure of what to do next. The sun beat down upon the ranch, illuminating the harsh truth of his situation. He had spent years fighting to keep this land afloat, resisting every storm that attempted to tear him down. Yet in one single moment, he found himself responsible for something far more delicate and far more complicated than any burden he had carried before. Leela Creed remained near the wagon, her posture rigid, her face pale beneath the wide brim of her worn hat. She looked small against the vastness of the ranch, fragile, out of place, and entirely exposed. The old woman who had escorted her cast one last lingering look toward Elias, then toward Leela, before climbing back onto the wagon seat. The aging mare pulling the wagon gave a tired groan as the woman steered her away, leaving Leela standing alone in the middle of the yard like a lost shadow. Elias watched as the wagon retreated down the trail, shrinking into the horizon until it became nothing but a moving speck swallowed by dust. When it vanished completely, he understood the full weight of Creed's demand. He had not been given a task. He had been given a person, a life, to protect. Not in exchange for payment or service or allegiance, but because a powerful man had decided convenience mattered more than compassion. Leela's gaze drifted across the ranch, taking in the broken fences, the empty cattle pens, and the sagging roof of the house she would now be staying in. A mixture of fear and resignation clouded her eyes. She seemed uncertain whether this place marked her salvation or the beginning of yet another form of captivity. Elias felt a tug in his chest, a protective instinct he did not expect. Her presence stirred something within him, perhaps pity, perhaps empathy, or perhaps the warning tremor of a bond forming where none should. Whatever it was, it compelled him to acknowledge that she was not just Creed's daughter. She was a human being stranded between two dangerous worlds, neither of which had ever given her comfort. The day grew warmer as hours passed, and chores called for his attention, yet Elias found himself struggling to return to the rhythm of his work. The stranger, now inhabiting his ranch, altered everything. He stole glances at her from afar, noticing how carefully she observed each corner of the land, as though learning its shape would help her determine whether she was safe. She moved slowly, stepping toward the ranch house with hesitant strides. The door creaked when she pushed it open, revealing the dim interior where dust danced in thin streaks of sunlight. Elias realized with a pang of embarrassment that the house had not been cleaned in months. He lived simply and alone, with no expectation that anyone else might one day share the space. Leela paused at the threshold, unsure whether she was allowed to enter. Elias kept his distance, watching her gather enough courage to step inside. When she finally did, her presence seemed to fill the house with a quiet, unfamiliar warmth. The worn walls, once echoing with loneliness, now echoed with something different: uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. Elias returned to his chores with newfound energy, though his thoughts remained tangled. Every now and then, he glimpsed Leela through the open window, wandering the interior with soft, uncertain steps. She touched the old furniture, brushed dust from the mantel, inspected the cracked floorboards, and eventually found the single bedroom. She stood there for a long time, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she expected discomfort. Perhaps she had never been without servants or luxury. But she made no sign of complaint or entitlement. Instead, she moved with the quiet resilience of someone who had endured far worse than this. Elias repaired the broken fence as the afternoon carried on. Sweat dripped from his brow, but his mind remained restless. The silence between them grew heavier with every hour. The ranch was no place for secrets, yet the girl brought many with her. He wondered what life she had lived behind the walls of her father's mansion. He wondered what dangers pursued her. He wondered what Creed had left unsaid. By sundown, Leela emerged from the house, drawn by the golden light spreading across the plains. Elias noticed she held herself more calmly now, though the caution remained in her eyes. She walked toward the barn, pausing to admire the way the fading sun painted everything in warm tones, turning broken fences golden and abandoned tools into gleaming silhouettes. Her delicate steps stirred memories Elias had long buried. Once, years ago, he had imagined a home filled with laughter, warmth, and partnership. But life had stripped those dreams away, leaving him only with hard earth and long, silent nights. Now, unexpectedly, another soul had stepped into that emptiness. Leela reached the barn and peered inside. Dusty beams, scattered hay, and the skeletal remains of the burned-out structure greeted her. She ran her hand along a charred post, her expression softening with empathy. She could see the scars of the ranch, his past just as easily as she carried her own. As twilight deepened, Elias led his horse to the trough. He noticed Leela standing at the edge of the yard, her figure outlined against the purple horizon. Her face was turned toward the distant mountains, where faint clouds drifted like ghosts across the sky. There was something heart-breakingly lonely in her posture, something that made Elias's chest tighten. He realized she was longing for a world she had never been allowed to experience freely. She looked toward the mountains, as though hoping they held answers to questions she had been too afraid to ask. Night settled over the ranch slowly. Crickets began their chorus, and the first stars appeared in the vast dark sky. Elias lit a lantern on the porch, allowing its glow to spill across the yard. The soft light reached Leela, bathing her in amber hues. She turned toward the house then, drawn by the warmth of the lantern, and walked back with steady steps. When she approached the porch, Elias stepped aside, giving her space. She passed him with a soft, cautious grace, her presence lingering like a faint breeze even after she entered the house. Inside, the lantern's glow cast gentle shadows across her features. She hesitated near the table, her eyes scanning the modest lay. Out the tin plates, the simple chairs, the patched curtains swaying lightly with the wind. She seemed to absorb the quiet comfort of the place, fragile yet strangely inviting. Elias felt his resolve harden in that moment. He had accepted this responsibility because he had no choice. But now he felt something deeper, a sense of duty born not from obligation, but from the recognition of her vulnerability, a vulnerability she hid beneath a brave facade. He would protect her, not because creed demanded it, not because his debt forced him, but because she deserved safety, dignity, and a life free from the shadows cast by her father's name. As the night deepened and the ranch quieted, Leela carefully closed the door to the small bedroom. Elias remained awake for a long time, sitting on the porch and watching the stars. The ranch felt different tonight, less empty, less forgotten. When the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain from the distant mountains, Elias sensed that changes were coming. Not just for them, but for the land itself. And though he didn't yet understand how, he knew their lives were now bound together by fate, circumstance, and a storm creeping steadily toward them. The next morning arrived with a chill that settled deep into the bones of the ranch. A pale light crept over the plains, stretching long shadows across the land, as though the night had not yet fully released its grip. Elias' heart stepped outside before the sun finished rising, carrying the heaviness of a man whose responsibilities had doubled overnight. The ranch had always woken slowly, but today it felt different. There was an unfamiliar presence within the walls of the house, a quiet pulse of life that shifted the energy of the place. Leela Creed, still new to the dust and the silence, moved with the hesitancy of a traveler stranded in an unknown land. Elias could feel her presence even from afar, though she made no sound and remained tucked within the small bedroom. The wind picked up across the valley as Elias returned to his morning tasks. He cleaned the troughs, checked the fence lines, and tried to fall back into the rhythm of his old routines. But the ranch did not feel the same, nor did he. Each sound seemed amplified, each creak of wood, each rustle of dry grass, each soft footstep inside the house. He knew this shift ran deeper than simple change. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to share space with another soul. It unsettled him, yet it also grounded him in a way he had not expected. By the time Leela stepped outside, the morning sun had brightened. She appeared cautiously, shielding her eyes as she adjusted to the golden light. She wore an old apron she had found in the kitchen and had tied her hair back in a soft, loose knot. There was a quiet determination in the way she carried herself, as if she was determined to be more than a burden. She paused on the porch, taking in the ranch with a long, slow breath. Elias watched her from the corral. He expected uncertainty in her expression, perhaps even fear. Instead, he saw something else entirely resolve, the kind he recognized from people who had survived hardship quietly, without complaint, because life had left them no other choice. She stepped forward, approaching the yard as though testing the earth beneath her feet. Her movements were delicate, but there was strength hidden beneath that fragility. She walked toward the garden plot near the barn, a patch of ground long neglected. The soil had hardened from months without tending, and the few remaining stalks of corn bent crookedly toward the ground, barely surviving. Leela knelt in the dirt, running her fingers through the dry soil. It was a simple gesture, but to Elias, watching from a distance, it revealed something profound. She was not afraid of work. She was not afraid of hardship. She was seeking connection to the one thing she had been denied her entire life: freedom. And even if the ranch was broken, it was still a place far from the suffocating control of her father. Elias felt an unexpected warmth spread in his chest. The ranch had not seen such gentle hands in years. The hours passed quietly, but the air held weight, a charged stillness that hinted at a brewing storm. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, creeping slowly over the plains. The temperature dropped as a cold breeze swept through the valley, bending the sparse trees and rattling the loose boards of the barn. Leela looked toward the sky, sensing the change. Her expression tightened with unease. She had likely never seen a storm out on open land, where there were no walls or guards to protect her. The wild felt unpredictable, untamed, and merciless, and yet she did not retreat inside. She followed Elias to the corral, sensing his efforts to secure the place against the coming winds. Elias worked with steady, practiced movements as he tied down loose equipment and guided the horse into the barn. Leela hovered nearby, observing the way he prepared for the storm. She studied each action, determined to understand this world she had been thrust into. Her eyes held a spark he had not seen the day before, an eagerness to learn, to help, to exist beyond the role her father had carved for her. When the first rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, an unease settled deep within Elias. Storms out here were unpredictable. They could nourish the earth or destroy it within moments, and this storm carried a heaviness that felt almost intentional, as though fate itself had sent it. Storm clouds thickened, turning the sky into a mass of writhing shadows. The wind howled, lifting dust in swirling spirals. Leela clutched the edge of her apron, bracing herself against the force of the gusts. A few loose shingles rattled on the roof of the house, and the windows shook as the storm grew closer. Elias gestured toward the porch, urging her quietly with his body language to take shelter. She hesitated, still wanting to help, but the wind grew so fierce that she finally retreated inside. Elias made one last round of the yard before following her, closing the door firmly against the rising gale. The storm struck moments later. Rain hammered the roof in relentless sheets, leaking through the old seams and dripping into small puddles on the floor. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the ranch in stark flashes of white. The wind roared like a wild beast, shaking the walls and sending shivers through the wooden frame of the house. Inside, the air felt thick with tension, not just from the storm, but from the unspoken questions swirling between them. Elias sensed Leela's fear, though she tried to hide it behind her composed posture. She stood near the window, staring out into the tempest with wide, unsettled eyes. But something else troubled her too, something deeper than fear of weather. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her, a turmoil Elias could sense, but not yet understand. She had been raised in a gilded cage, surrounded by walls and wealth, yet denied the one thing every soul deserves: freedom. Now she stood in a world she barely knew, facing a future carved from uncertainty. Elias sat near the table, listening to the storm batter the ranch. The structure groaned under the weight of the wind. Every crash of thunder echoed across the walls like a warning. Rain seeped through cracks, pooling on the floorboards in narrow streams. Leela moved to help, grabbing an old cloth and placing it beneath the dripping ceiling. Elias watched her in silence. She could have stayed still and waited out the storm in fear, but instead she chose to act with quiet strength. Each gesture she made, no matter how small, revealed a depth of character that surprised him. The night grew darker as the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the yard in sudden, blinding bursts. Elias heard the distant groan of a tree succumbing to the wind, followed by a heavy crash that echoed across the valley. The horse in the barn whinnied anxiously as thunder rolled across the plains. Hours passed, though they felt far longer. At times, the storm eased just enough for Elias to believe it might be ending, only to return with renewed fury. The house shook but held firm, a small beacon of warmth and safety amidst the chaos outside. Leela remained awake through the night, her eyes never fully leaving the window. Elias noticed exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, yet she forced herself to remain alert. She was fighting memories of danger, helplessness, and the isolation her father had kept her in. This storm represented more than weather. It represented fear she had been forced to swallow for years. At last, near dawn, the wind began to calm. The rain softened into gentle patters. The sky, once blackened with torment, shifted into muted shades of gray and lavender. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt both heavy and cleansing. Elias stepped outside once the wind settled. The ranch bore fresh scars. The corral fence had collapsed on one side. The barn roof had lost several shingles, and fallen branches littered the yard. But the house stood strong, and for that he felt immense gratitude. Behind him, Leela stepped onto the porch. She took in the aftermath with a thoughtful expression. The storm had not broken her. It had hardened her resolve. Elias sensed a change in her, not fear, but determination. She was beginning to see that life on the ranch, though harsh, offered something precious she had never tasted before. Freedom, once tasted, could transform even the most fragile heart. But as the calm settled over the land, Elias could not shake the feeling that this storm was only the beginning. Something darker was on its way, something tied to Leela's past, and to the enemies her father feared. The valley stood quiet, but the horizon whispered danger. The storm had passed, but the air the next morning felt heavy with the weight of something unseen. The plains glistened under a pale sun, still wet from the long night of rain. Pools of water gathered in shallow dips across the yard, reflecting the soft light like broken pieces of glass scattered across the earth. The ranch breathed quietly, exhausted from the battle it had just endured. Elias Hart stood at the edge of the porch, surveying the damage with a weary focus. The collapsed corral fence, the fallen branches, the scattered debris, all of it would take days to repair. Yet his mind lingered not on broken wood or battered ground, but on the young woman who stepped out behind him. Leila Creed moved with slow, measured steps. The storm had left her drained, but there was a new steadiness in her posture, as though she had emerged from the chaos stronger than she had been the night before. She paused beside Elias, her gaze fixed on the battered ranch. In her expression, he read a determination he recognized well. The determination of someone choosing to keep moving forward despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite past wounds that refused to heal. For the first time since her arrival, she did not remain close to the house. Instead, she walked across the yard, her boots splashing through puddles as she approached the fallen fence. The sun illuminated the damp strands of her hair, giving her an appearance both fragile and resilient, like a flower bent but not broken by a storm. Elias followed her silently, surprised by how naturally she began clearing branches and righting toppled beams. Her hands, though delicate, worked with a surprising strength. She did not shrink from the mud or from the splinters that occasionally grazed her skin. Her eyes held the quiet intensity of someone seeking purpose in the aftermath of ruin. The ranch had never seen such quiet determination in years. Perhaps not since Elias himself was young. Filled with dreams, the world had soon eroded. Watching Leila work beside him stirred memories long buried, memories of companionship, hope, and the warmth of shared burdens. By midday, the sun climbed higher, drying the wet earth and warming the chilled air. The ranch slowly returned to life. Birds emerged from the thickets, chirping cautiously as though testing the quiet. The horse in the barn shifted restlessly, craving movement after the storm's confinement. Even the distant hills seemed to glow with renewed vigor under the soft light. But despite the calmness around them, Elias felt something else lingering, an unease he could not shake. The storm had left more than broken fences behind. It had awakened something deeper, something tied to the shadows Leila carried with her. For hours, Leila remained close to Elias as they repaired the ranch. Each time she paused, she scanned the horizon with a cautious gaze, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear over the ridge. It was a habit she had not shown the day before, and its presence unsettled him. Mid-afternoon drifted into slow, golden sunlight. The sky stretched wide and clear, deceptively peaceful. Elias continued his work, driving nails into new wooden beams, when a strange tension pulled at the air. Leila paused suddenly, her body stiffening as though struck by an invisible force. Elias noticed her gaze fixed toward the western trail, the same direction Creed and his riders had disappeared days earlier. Her breath caught, her posture tightening. A thin trail of dust rose in the distance. Elias froze, a cold ripple traveling through his spine. Riders, several of them, moving with determined speed. The ranch had few visitors, none who arrived unannounced, and certainly none who approached with such urgency. Leila stepped back instinctively, nearly tripping over a bucket as fear flooded her eyes. She clutched the edge of the fence with trembling hands. Her reaction was far too immediate, far too intense, to be mere surprise. Whoever those riders were, she recognized the danger they brought. Elias's protective instinct surged like wildfire. He stepped forward, angling himself between Leela and the approaching figures. He scanned the distant shapes, but the sunlight made it difficult to distinguish details. All he saw were dark silhouettes cutting swiftly across the plains. 5, maybe 6 riders moving with ruthless precision. Leela's breath hitched, her shoulders shook. The fear in her body spoke volumes. These were not friends, not messengers, not harmless travelers. Whoever they were connected to the life she had fled. The riders drew closer. Elias noticed their horses carried dust from long travel. Their clothing, dark and unmarked, lacked the insignias of Creed's men. They moved with practiced unity, a formation too precise to be accidental. They were searching for something or someone. The tension in the air turned suffocating. Before the riders reached the ranch border, they slowed, fanning out in a loose semicircle. Their posture held no hesitation, no uncertainty. They observed the ranch with cold calculation, scanning every corner with sharp eyes. Leela remained behind Elias, her body pressed against the beam of the fence. Her fear was palpable, trembling through every breath she attempted to steady. She lowered her gaze, hoping to become invisible, but the riders were not the kind to overlook anything. They assessed the damaged fence, the barn, the house, and then their attention landed on Leela. Even from a distance, Elias saw the moment one of the riders spotted her. The man straightened, lifting his chin in grim recognition. His posture stiffened with predatory intent. They had found what they were looking for. A chill tore through Elias's chest. This was the danger Creed had warned of, though not nearly in enough words. These were the threats hunting Leela. Creed had not exaggerated. Leela was the target of enemies who moved boldly across open land, unafraid of pursuit. Elias felt a powerful urge to shield her from those watchful eyes. This was not a debt. This was not a temporary obligation. This was a life at risk, an innocent woman being hunted by men who saw her as leverage, not as a human being. The riders remained motionless at the edge of the property, staring at the ranch with unsettling patience. The leader raised his hand, signaling to the others. They did not advance, nor did they retreat. They simply watched. Elias recognized the strategy instantly. They were waiting to see who else lived here, waiting to assess the ranch's vulnerability, waiting to determine whether Elias was alone or whether reinforcements might appear. The tension stretched unbearably. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. After several long minutes, the leader lowered his hand. The riders turned their horses in unison, retreating back toward the trail. They did not ride fast, nor in panic. Their exit felt deliberate, calculated. They had delivered a message without uttering a word. They would return. Leela collapsed onto the nearest beam, her breathing ragged. Elias felt the world shift beneath him. The danger was no longer distant. It had arrived at his doorstep, watching, waiting, circling like wolves around a weakened herd. For the rest of the day, Leela remained close to the house, refusing to step more than a few paces away. The fear that had briefly loosened its hold tightened around her again, stronger than before. Elias worked silently, his mind racing with unspoken questions. Who were those men? What did they want with her? And how long before they returned? As dusk settled over the valley, Elias walked the perimeter of the ranch, checking every vulnerable spot. The world felt eerily calm, the sky glowing pink against the darkening plains. But the peace was deceiving. Leela watched him from the porch, her eyes reflecting the fading light. The storm had tested them, but the real storm, the one Creed feared, was only beginning to reveal itself. Night fell slowly, stretching shadows across the land. Leela retreated inside, her posture heavy with dread. Elias lingered outside, staring at the distant ridge where the riders had vanished. The land was too quiet, the air too still. the horizon too dark. Danger had found them, and it would not leave quietly. Night laid its heavy cloak over the valley, darker than usual and thick with warning. The ranch, already worn from the recent storm, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of approaching danger. Elias' heart stood outside long after the last faint glow vanished from the sky, scanning the hills with sharp, weary eyes. Every shadow felt suspicious. Every sound, even the whisper of wind, sounded like a hoofbeat in disguise. The riders who had appeared earlier left behind a silence that unsettled him far more than the storm ever had. Their retreat had not been fear, it had been calculation. Men like that did not approach unless they had a purpose, and Leela Creed was clearly that purpose. They had seen her, recognized her, and now they would be back. Inside the house, a single lamp burned softly through the window, casting a warm square of light onto the porch. Leela moved within the faint glow, her silhouette shifting as she paced. She wrapped her arms around herself, not in cold, but in fear that had lodged itself deep within her chest the moment those riders fixed their gaze upon her. Elias finally stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. The house felt smaller than usual, the air thick with unspoken tension. Leela stood near the table, staring at the wooden boards, as though hoping to find answers hidden in their grain. Her face carried exhaustion, but her eyes held something stronger, a quiet dread sharpened by memory. She had lived under the shadow of her father's enemies for years, but never before had the danger been so close, so immediate, or so fixated on finding her. The night stretched on without mercy. Elias slept lightly, waking at every creak and distant rustle. Leela slept not at all. She remained tucked in the small bedroom with the door slightly open, listening to the quiet, unable to shake the image of those dark riders circling the ranch like carrion birds. Dawn came with a muted, pale light. The sky seemed hesitant to brighten, as though the sun itself sensed the tension clinging to the land. Elias rose early, the weight of the coming day pressing heavily upon him. He stepped outside to scan the horizon, every muscle tight with anticipation. Nothing stirred at first, but the silence felt deceptive. Leela joined him shortly after sunrise, her movements slow but steady. She looked tired, yet determined not to let fear paralyze her. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and gazed toward the trail where the riders had appeared. The earth held no fresh hoofprints. The valley seemed undisturbed, yet the unease in her posture did not fade. Elias sensed that she was fighting an internal battle won between panic and resolve. She was not the delicate, sheltered girl her father had kept hidden. She possessed quiet strength, a resilience shaped by years of enforced silence. Yet all of that strength trembled beneath the weight of danger growing ever closer. The morning hours passed slowly. Elias kept himself busy reinforcing the ranch. He repaired the fence that had collapsed in the storm, checking each beam twice. He moved equipment into the barn, locking it carefully. Every action he took carried purpose. The ranch needed structure. Leela needed security, and he needed to be ready. Leela, determined not to remain idle, cleaned the inside of the house with meticulous care. She moved quietly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace. The small bedroom looked lived in for the first time in years, its dust wiped away, its window cracked open to let in the breeze. The kitchen had regained its order. Even the porch, once cluttered with old tools, now appeared tidy. Her presence, gentle yet steady, worked its way into the ranch's rhythm, but the peace they created did not last long. By midday, Elias sensed something shifting. A stillness settled over the land, a silence so complete that even the birds seemed to hold their breath. The wind, once steady, stilled abruptly. The air grew heavy with the unmistakable charge of approaching trouble. Elias stepped onto the porch, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the distant hills. He felt it before he saw it, a tremor in the earth, faint but growing. A vibration carried across the dry ground in a slow, steady rhythm. Hoof beats, not one horse, many. Leela emerged from the house, her face draining of color as soon as she heard it. She clutched the doorframe, bracing herself as fear rippled through her like a cold gust. Elias moved instinctively, positioning himself between her and the open plains. Moments later, the riders came into view. Not 6 this time, 10 at least, perhaps more. They approached with grim determination, riding in formation across the ridge, before descending toward the ranch. Dust rose beneath their horses' hooves, turning the air into a cloud of pale grit. The riders wore no insignias, no markers. Their clothing was dark, their hats pulled low, their posture rigid. These were not men seeking negotiation. These were hunters closing in on their prey. Leela trembled. Elias felt the ranch contract around them, shrinking as danger advanced. The riders halted at the edge of the yard, close enough for their expressions to be visible. Hard faces, cold eyes, and the unmistakable look of men accustomed to violence. Their presence sent a chill through the valley. Elias's heart pounded, but he remained steady. The ranch, battered as it was, stood behind him. Leela stood just inside the doorframe, her eyes rimmed with fear, yet holding the slightest flicker of trust in him. It was that faint, fragile trust that hardened Elias's resolve. The riders scanned the ranch with sharp precision. Their leader sat at the center of the formation, a broad, shouldered man with a presence that felt heavier than the others. His gaze drifted to the porch, resting first on Elias, then on Leela. Recognition flashed across his face. Satisfaction followed. They had found her again. One of the riders shifted, moving slightly forward, as though preparing to approach. But Elias stepped off the porch, planting his boots firmly in the dirt. His posture alone sent a message clearer than any words. This land, though failing, though broken, was his, and no one, not Creed, not his enemies, and not these riders, would take anything from it without a fight. The riders exchanged glances. The tension thickened. A silent standoff stretched across the yard like a drawn cord ready to snap. The leader finally raised his hand, and without warning, the riders retreated, not in fear, but in strategy, pulling back with the calm confidence of men who knew this was only the first step. They disappeared toward the ridge, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than their arrival. Leela collapsed into a chair once the dust settled, her breathing rapid and shaky. Elias remained outside long after they vanished, watching the hills with a dark, uneasy certainty. This was no longer a matter of debt. No longer a temporary responsibility. This was a threat that would not end until confronted. Those men would return. And next time, they would not simply watch. The sun dipped lower, staining the sky in hues of crimson. As dusk fell over the ranch, Elias felt a shift inside himself, a steely resolve forming where uncertainty once lived. The line had been drawn, and he would not allow them to cross it, not while he was still breathing. The sun rose pale and thin the morning after the riders' return, as though weighed down by an unspoken heaviness. A reddish tint stained the horizon, spreading slowly across the land like a warning. The ranch, usually quiet in the dawn, seemed to hold its breath. Even the cattle in the far pasture moved sluggishly, unsettled by the strange tension settling over the valley. Elias' heart had barely slept. He had spent the night moving through the ranch with relentless focus, fortifying its weak points, securing the barn, checking the windows, ensuring every potential entry point was reinforced. The ranch was old, worn by storms and years of neglect. but he pushed it to stand tall for one more day. One final stand. Inside the house, Leela Creed moved quietly, her steps soft yet purposeful. She cooked a small breakfast, though she barely touched it. Her mind was miles away, wandering the long and painful paths of her past paths, marked by fear, loss, and the constant sense of being hunted. But that morning, something different stirred within her, a growing awareness that the man who sheltered her now was no longer motivated by obligation or debt. Something deeper had rooted itself between them, unspoken yet unshakable. The sun had barely cleared the hilltops when Elias noticed movement far beyond the valley. A faint line appeared along the distant ridge. Dust rose behind it, drifting upward like smoke. The riders were returning, more numerous and better organized than before. He watched them silently, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing with a focus sharpened by resolve. He felt no fear now, only determination. The line had been drawn the day prior, and today would decide everything: her safety, his land, and the fragile bond that had formed between them. Leela joined him on the porch, her breath catching in her throat as soon as she saw the dust rising. She clutched her hands together, fighting the instinct to flee, but she stayed rooted beside him, anchored by the knowledge that she was no longer facing danger alone. As the riders approached, their numbers became clearer. Not 10, not 15, nearly 20. They moved with grim precision, descending from the ridge and spreading across the open field in a formation that spoke of practiced confidence. These were not men seeking to negotiate. They were men who intended to take whatever they believed belonged to them and crush whatever stood in their way. Elias stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the dirt. He positioned himself in front of the house, blocking their path to Leela. His heart pounded with a steady rhythm, heavy but unwavering. The ranch behind him felt alive with memories: his father's legacy, the years he spent building and rebuilding, the storms weathered both inside and out. He had already lost too much in his life. He refused to lose the one thing he had unexpectedly begun to care about. The riders halted at the edge of the yard. The leader, the broad-shouldered man who had stared at Leela with cold recognition the day before, sat tall in his saddle. His expression twisted with the confidence of someone who believed the day already belonged to him. But he underestimated the heart of a man who had decided he would not bend. Tension thickened the air, simmering like heat rising from desert sand. The riders' horses shifted restlessly, sensing the hostility. A crow circled overhead, cutting a black silhouette across the morning sky. The world felt suspended, balanced at the brink of something irreversible. What followed unfolded with the ruthless speed of a storm. The leader signaled his men forward. A wave of riders advanced, hooves pounding the earth, dust spiraling into the air. Elias braced himself, every muscle tightening, every thought focused on keeping them away from the house. He moved with precision, born from years of ranch labor and instinctive self-preservation. The land itself guided him: the dips in the earth, the scattered barrels, the broken fence line, all pieces of his world that now served as improvised defenses. The riders pressed closer, circling, searching for a weakness. Leela watched from inside the doorway, fear tightening her chest until breathing became difficult. She wanted to run to him, to pull him back, to end the madness before it consumed them both. But she knew interfering would only make him more vulnerable. She stayed hidden, clutching the doorway until her knuckles whitened. The confrontation stretched on, a tense dance of motion and intimidation. The riders repeatedly probed for openings, but Elias refused to yield an inch. His actions spoke in ways words never could. He would not allow them near her. He would not allow them to decide her fate. He would not allow them to break what little peace the ranch held. Eventually, the leader dismounted, stepping forward with heavy, deliberate steps. His men remained mounted, forming a wall of bodies and horses behind him. The man scanned the ranch with a silent calculation, eyes finally locking onto Elias with cold finality. Time thickened around them, weighted with the inevitability of the moment. The leader motioned for two of his men to advance. They moved quickly, intent on forcing their way past Elias. But something about the rancher's stance halted them. A message, unspoken yet unmistakable, flickered through the dusty air. If they stepped closer, he would resist with everything he had left. The riders hesitated, the leader's jaw clenched in irritation. The standoff silent, seething dragged on until the tension became unbearable. And then, slowly, the leader raised his hand again. This time, the command was final. The riders turned away, not because they had given up, but because they realized something profoundly simple. The woman was no longer a debt to be collected. She was protected now, sheltered, claimed not through ownership or obligation, but through willingness and resolve. And any attempt to take her would only ignite resistance fiercer than the reward was worth. The leader stared at Elias for a long moment, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. Then he mounted his horse, turned sharply, and rode away. His men followed, their silhouettes retreating across the valley. Dust slowly settled in their wake, drifting across the land in soft, fading clouds. The storm, at long last, had passed. Elias remained in the yard for a long time after they disappeared over the hill. His breath came slowly, heavily, as though his lungs were reacclimating to the absence of danger. His sweat, dampened hair clung to his forehead, and his hands trembled not in fear, but in the overwhelming release of tension that had held him rigid for hours. Leela emerged from the doorway, her steps quiet and hesitant. When she reached him, she stopped just a few feet away, her eyes glistening with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper, something that had been quietly growing between them long before. The riders arrived. The land around them softened under the warm glow of afternoon. The ranch, battered but standing, seemed to exhale. The valley stretched in peaceful silence, touched by the soft rustle of wind moving through the grass. Elias looked toward the horizon, the weight of the morning slowly lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, the valley felt like it held a future, one not shaped by loneliness, but by connection. One shaped by a presence he never expected, but now could not imagine living without. Leela stood beside him, gazing out over the land that had given her refuge. Her fear slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. The debt that brought her here had tried to destroy them both. But instead, it had changed everything. It had given him purpose again. It had given her safety, and it had given them a chance neither had ever thought possible. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the valley, the ranch finally felt whole. The danger had passed, their bond had strengthened, and the future, uncertain yet full of promise, waited just beyond the last line of sunset.